No, really?
All right. So we're leaving behind all that crazy cytosyncytioblasto junk that sounds like science fiction. We're going to talk about blood. We all know what blood is, so that's good.
I'm struggling, guys.
And this is the beginning of the cardiovascular system. The cardiovascular system is basically like a glorified pump system that you'd have like in engineering or something, you know. 3 things you need with a pump system. You need the pump, you need some kind of tubing for the system, and then you need some material to go through the system. So the blood's the material that goes through the system, obviously. The heart's the pump, and then the tubing is the blood vessels. So we cover the blood first, then we do the heart, then we do the blood vessels. And that's also probably how they rate in sort of difficulty. Blood's maybe the easiest, then heart's a little bit more difficult, then blood vessels gets kind of tricky. So this is a big picture of the chapter, functions and properties of blood. I'm guessing no one has looked at this chapter yet. Is that accurate?
Correct.
Good. I thought as much. So I won't have a high expectation. I will lower my expectations as low as they can possibly go. Does anyone have any idea what a possible function of the blood might be?
Moving nutrients around.
Sure. Transporting oxygen around the body. So you guys know this stuff already. What else? Protection from what? Snakes? Did like bacteria, viruses, yeah, like the white blood cells give you protection against stuff like that. So that's pretty good. Regulating body temperature, that's an important thing. So we'll talk about that. In terms of the properties of the blood, going back to A&P1, anyone remember which of the 4 basic tissue types blood is classified as? Connected, good. Anytime you look at a connected tissue, you can either look at the cells that are in there, or you can look at the space outside the cells, which is called the extracellular matrix. So in the case of the blood, the cells are what? What make up the cells of the blood? 3 things. What are they? Oh, just guess. What'd you say? Okay, that was a really bad guess. Guess cells. What cells make up the blood? Red blood cells, white blood cells, and then one more. Platelets. All right. So these 3 guys here, these are basically like the cells of the connective tissue, okay? Except technically speaking, the platelets aren't really cells, they're like little pieces of cells, but whatever. Then you got the extracellular matrix. That's the liquid part of the blood. What's the name for the liquid part of the blood? Plasma, okay? Now, most connective tissues, if you remember, we had a whole bunch, like cartilage and fat and bone. Most connective tissues have like some firmness to them, like they have some structure. They're not a liquid. What makes blood a liquid as opposed to all those other connective tissue types? Does anyone know? That's exactly what the person this morning said, and my response to them was, well, don't those other tissue types that I mentioned, don't they have water in them? And they do, so it's a bad answer. Yeah.
Okay.
I don't know why I'm so bitchy. I gave up the pass. I'm sorry. I don't know. I apologize. I'm sorry.
For 5 minutes
A little touchy. I don't know what's going on. Sorry about that.
You didn't have time to drink your coffee.
I didn't have time to drink.
Yeah.
That's actually kind of true. I didn't drink enough coffee yet.
Go ahead.
No, I will save the torture for anybody and tell you the reason why it's liquid has to do with what's not in the matrix of the blood. Okay? Anyone remember that tough protein that's like a rope that you find in most collagen? Thank you. Collagen is not in the plasma of the blood. There's no fibers like collagen or elastic fibers in the plasma, and so it gives it a liquid consistency. Okay? How many liters of blood do we have?
5.
That's right, 5 liters of blood. That's a pretty good estimate. Women are usually, you'd say maybe 4 to 5 liters, and men are usually 5 to 6 liters, but 5 is like a really good number to go with. We'll talk about formation of blood cells. Where in the body are blood cells formed?
Bone.
Yeah, bone. What part of the bone?
Bone marrow.
Bone marrow. What type of bone marrow?
Red.
Red bone marrow. What kind of blood cells are formed in the red bone marrow?
Both.
Yeah, it's a kind of a trick question. All blood cells are made in the red bone marrow, and the platelets as well. So all are made in the red bone marrow. Why is it called the red bone marrow if all of them are made there?
Doesn't it
Because
look
it's
red?
mainly red.
Because it's mainly red. It looks red. You'll see in a second. There's a hell of a lot more red blood cells than there are white blood cells and platelets, so it makes it appear red. But don't be tricked. They're all made in the red bone marrow. We'll talk about the red blood cells first, and this is actually where we won't get much further than this. We're just going to really focus on the red blood cells today. What's the main function of the red blood cells? To carry oxygen around the body. Okay, and what's special about the shape or the structure of a red blood cell? It kind of looks like a donut. Yeah, kind of looks like a donut. What else? What's special about the organelles and the nucleus with a red blood cell? You really don't know? It doesn't have any of them. It doesn't have a nucleus. Red blood cells don't have a nucleus. They don't have any mitochondria. They don't have any rough ER. Instead, they're just packed with lots and lots of this protein that carries oxygen. What's the protein that carries oxygen? Hemoglobin. Okay? All right. So, keep on here.
See all that information. Works.
All right, so functions of the blood. Transporting respiratory gases. What are the respiratory gases? Oxygen and carbon dioxide. Okay. Also transporting nutrients. What do we mean by nutrients? What's your body's favorite nutrient?
Like a protein or
Glucose, right? So transporting glucose. And then also, let's not forget those horrible hormones that you had to learn about in chapter 18, right? They rely on the blood to carry them to their destinations, right? Unless it's like a local hormone, right? Helps regulate your body pH and your temperature. So your blood is in contact with most body tissues via the blood vessels. So in its interactions with the other tissues, it can kind of help control the pH in areas and then also control the temperature, all right? Blood can carry a lot of heat with it. And by deciding where the blood flows to in your body, you can control your temperature. And I think I gave you this example in the skin chapter. What happens when, let's say, you go to the gym and you see somebody there and they're kind of going nuts at the gym, probably doing more than they should, and they're overheating? What color does their face look like? Red. Okay? That's your blood and your blood vessels trying to help cool you off, okay? Your blood carries a lot of heat with it, and when you're hot, you will send the blood close to the surface of your body, close to the skin, where hopefully the blood will be able to give off its heat to the outside environment and cool you off, okay? So you will dilate your little blood vessels in your skin, and you'll appear red at the time while you're trying to cool yourself off. What color does your skin become when you're like cold? Yeah, it can become pale or even bluish, and that's because you're clamping down on those blood vessels that go up to your skin and trying to keep the nice warm blood in your core so you don't lose any of that heat to the outside environment. Okay. Sorry. Okay. So that's another thing. And then lastly, protection. So protection, we can talk about blood clotting. What's blood clotting?
When we get scabs?
Yeah, that's when you get scabs and what's the purpose of blood clotting? Yeah, to prevent blood loss after you've damaged a blood vessel, right? You got a hole in a blood vessel, you got to stop it up somehow, got to fix it so that you don't keep losing blood through that hole. And then lastly, immune defenses. And, that's what type of blood cells are involved in immune defenses?
White blood cells.
White blood cells, right? Now, in this chapter, we are just going to scratch the surface of what white blood cells do. But later on, when we do, anyone know what organ system we're going to talk about immunity with? Lymphatic system. When we talk about the lymphatic system, then we're really going to get crazy into like the details of how it all works. All right, so 5 liters of a fluid connective tissue, viscous and more dense than water. That's due mostly to like the cells that are in the blood, okay? Slightly warmer than your core body temperature. What's the sort of the textbook number for your body temperature in Fahrenheit? 98.6. So this is a little bit warmer than that. And then the pH, you can see it's not quite neutral, but just a little bit on the basic side, 7.35 to 7.45. What's this? So you guys know this stuff already. So easy. What's that? White. Okay, and then those are purple blood cells. No, those are platelets. So it's a liquid connective tissue. So just like any connective tissue, you can talk about the cell part, or you can talk about the extracellular matrix, right? The part outside of the cells. So the cell part, they call them the formed elements. It's not a 80s rock band, okay? Anyway, the formed elements include, the reason why they don't call them cells is because of the platelets, okay? The platelets are not cells. The platelets are pieces of cells. So that's why they call them formed elements. But that's going to make up about 45% of your blood volume. The other 55% is made up of the plasma. And again, that's the extracellular matrix. It's got a lot of water in it, as you'll see in a second, but it doesn't have any big proteins such as collagen, doesn't have any fiber proteins, and that's why it has a liquid consistency. If you put blood into a centrifuge, what's a centrifuge? One of those things that spin around, right? If you put blood into a centrifuge, these different layers would separate. And the densest and the heaviest would be the red blood cells, and they would move down to the bottom. Then in the middle, somewhere, you'd have the white blood cells and the platelets. And then at the top, you'd have the plasma. Okay. Someone, somewhere, decided to name the white blood cells and platelets the Buffy coat. Whatever. All right. So plasma, let's talk about that first, and then we'll talk about the formed elements. Plasma is mostly water, 91.5% water. But there's other stuff mixed in. You do have some proteins. Now these proteins are not as big as collagen. They're not fibrous proteins, so the blood can still be liquid and have some proteins in it, just not the big collagen ones. And we'll talk about those three guys in a moment: albumins, globulins, and fibrinogen. Then the other part, the other solutes, only makes up 1.5%, but this is still a really important part because this is going to include electrolytes such as sodium and chloride. It's going to include nutrients like glucose. It's going to include the gases, oxygen and carbon dioxide. You'll see a little bit later in this lecture, but mostly in the respiratory lecture, there is some oxygen and carbon dioxide that's dissolved in the plasma, okay? However, most of the oxygen is actually inside of the red blood cells attached to the hemoglobin. It's not out dissolved in the plasma, okay? We'll talk about that though. Regulatory substances, that's a fancy name for what? Anyone know what they mean by regulatory substances? What's that? Somebody said, I think.
Hormones?
Yeah, they just mean hormones. Don't ask me why they didn't just say hormones, but that's what they're talking about. And then lastly, waste products, things like urea, ammonia, things that you need to get rid of in your kidneys. Those are going to be in the plasma as well. All right, let's talk about the proteins then. The most abundant one is albumin. I imagine that somehow, some way, it must have looked white under something, right? Remember our prefix al means like white. But the other fun fact about it, it's kind of like the Valentine's Day protein. It's apparently got a heart shape to it, okay? It's just over 8 nanometers in size. Is that big or small? Small. It's really small. What's a nanometer? Those of you that are good at metric.
It's like it'll be like 10 to like
1/1000
Right, it's like 1 billionth of a meter, right? A meter's about like a yard. So if you could divide that into a billion parts and then take 8 of them, that's basically what the size of albumin would be. So it's very small. I don't even know how they know it's heart-shaped. Maybe they just thought it'd be cute because like no one would check on it because they can't see it. I don't know. Albumin synthesized in the liver. That's a pattern you're going to see again and again. There's a lot of proteins in the blood. Most of them have been put there by the liver. The liver is a great chemical factory. It does a lot of different things, but one of the things it does is it's making most of these proteins that you find in the blood. Albumin also contributes to the blood viscosity. What does the word viscosity mean?
Like thickness.
The thickness, right? Most of the viscosity is due to the big cells, right? The red blood cells, the white blood cells, the platelets. However, there's so much of this albumin that it plays a role as well. The albumin also helps create osmotic pressure that, albumin is, it's not able to easily pass out of the plasma through the walls of the blood vessels. So it's kind of trapped inside the blood vessels. And that creates a drawing force that pulls water into your blood vessels. And that's known as the blood osmotic pressure. And that helps to keep your blood pressure up, okay? We'll talk about blood osmotic pressure more when we do chapter 21. That's when we start talking about capillary exchange and things like that. But just remember this guy, albumin. It's a big player in creating that blood osmotic pressure. It also acts like a carrier molecule. What's a carrier molecule? Something that carries things around, all right? So
Is it?
what are the things called, going back to A&P 1, what are the things called that love water and dissolve in water? Hydrophilic solutes, right? The plasma is mostly water, right? So things that are hydrophilic, they'll generally dissolve in the plasma just fine, and they can be carried without needing a special carrier molecule. Okay, they're fine. But what's the name of the things that fear water? Hydrophobic. Things that are hydrophobic, they don't mix well with the plasma. They kind of layer out. And if you want them to kind of temporarily dissolve, if you will, so that they can be carried around your body effectively, you have to attach them to a carrier molecule. And things that are, if you remember, anyone remember what organic molecules tend to be hydrophobic? Starts with an L. Lipids. All right? Lipids tend to be hydrophobic, so you attach them to carrier molecules. One of the common carrier molecules is albumin. All right. So globulins, then, they're the next most common. And there's lots of different types of globulins, but the most famous are the gamma globulins. And you're like, I never heard of that. And that's because we usually they go by a different name that we're more familiar with. Antibodies. What are antibodies? They fight off infection. They're proteins that fight off infections. Okay, that's what antibodies are. Proteins that fight off infections. Antibodies are produced by a certain type of white blood cell called a B lymphocyte or a B cell. And, they can attack bacteria and viruses and do a lot of beneficial things. We'll talk a heck of a lot more about antibodies when we get to the lymphatic system chapter, okay? But just remember this is another name for it. And then the third most common type is fibrinogen. Fibrinogen is an important protein that forms blood clots, okay? We'll discuss clotting next week, but clotting is basically a series of reactions where one reaction leads to another reaction, leads to another reaction, and by the end of it, you've created this net made out of this protein that kind of will cover the hole in the blood vessel and draw the hole together so that it repairs itself so that you don't lose any blood through that hole anymore. All right, 3 types of formed elements. Red blood cells, white blood cells, and platelets. So this explains, why it's called the red bone marrow. If you look at and this is also going to explain, next week you're going to get a chance to look under the microscope at blood smears, okay? And chances are when you look, you're going to see a ton of what immediately? A ton of red blood cells, all right? You may remember this from A&P 1. We did actually look at blood smears in A&P 1. At that time, though, you didn't really have to identify anything except the red blood cells. So red blood cells are going to be everywhere. Why are they everywhere? Well, just look at the numbers up here, all right? Around 5 million per microliter of blood compared with around 7,000 and maybe say around 300,000 or so. So there's a hell of a lot more red blood cells, and you're going to find them right away. You're going to have to scan around a little bit before you find the white blood cells. By the way, how big is a microliter of blood? If anybody, any guesses how big a microliter is?
1,000.
A tenth of a milliliter?
1,000.
Yeah, I think it probably is a tenth of a milliliter. That wasn't the way I was going to say it, but yeah. So can everyone know how big a millimeter is? Dude, Show me what a millimeter looks like. Yeah.
I can't.
You can't do it. It's too no. Anyway, a millimeter is like that, right? Now picture a little box using the millimeter as the length of each wall, and that's what a microliter is. And in one of that little tiny things, there's 5 million or so red blood cells. So there's a ton of red blood cells. Apologize. This might be my cue to go.
Go.
There we go.
Cue away. Little break, little hiatus.
All right. So talk amongst yourselves. I will be back. I've mentally recorded who's in the room. I'm going to be really distraught if anyone leaves when I come back. I'm kidding. Don't leave. I've still got more important stuff to say. I promise I'll be back. So microliter, really small, lots of stuff inside of it, blah, 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 blah. Yeah, so on to the next slide. So most of the blood is the red blood cells, and somewhere along the line, because they are important for carrying oxygen, somebody decided it was pretty important to come up with a evaluation of how many red blood cells a person has in their blood, and they came up with this test that's called the hematocrit. Everyone heard of the hematocrit before? You will. You'll see. It's probably one of the most common blood tests that they order, all right? And it's just giving you a percentage of your total blood volume that's made up of red blood cells. And in a woman, it's somewhere around 38 to 46% is normal. And in a man, it's 40 to 54%. The reason it's higher in men is because testosterone stimulates the synthesis of erythropoietin, which we'll talk about in a little bit, and that's a hormone that causes red blood cell production. So more testosterone leads to more EPO, which leads to more red blood cell production. All right. The higher your hematocrit is, the more fatigue resistant you are. So if you're doing sports, especially endurance type sports like running a race or something, or going in like just anything that you're going to be doing, like a marathon, doing something for a long period of time where your body's prone to getting tired and worn out, there is an advantage to having more red blood cells. And I'll get back, just put that in the back of your mind. I'll get back to that topic in a second. I don't even want to explain it. I'm not going to explain it. You're just going to have to be left in suspense. There'll only be 50 questions about it in the next exam. No, I'm just kidding. There won't be any questions. White blood cells, a lot less common than red blood cells, but that doesn't mean that they're not a pain in the butt. They are a pain in the butt because there are 5 different types of white blood cells, and you will have to identify the different ones next week under the microscope. Okay? We're not really going to talk about white blood cells today, other than to mention these 5 different types that you have. So you can see the percentages of each. By far the most common type are the neutrophils. And when you look at the blood smears next week, you're going to see a lot of red blood cells first, but probably the first white blood cell you see, I would bet, is going to be a neutrophil. Okay? They're very common. The next most common are something called lymphocytes, and these include your T lymphocytes, which are also known as your T cells, and it includes your B lymphocytes, which are also known as your B cells. And then you get into something called monocytes, eosinophils, and then the least common are something called basophils. Basophils are so uncommon that next week I will make a wager that no one will find a basophil, and I will put 25 cents on the line. Wait. I'll make it $1. I will make, who's the cheapskate now? I'll make it $1. $1.50. Come on, that's crazy.
I thought he was talking about the graders.
Anyway, I will make it $1 next week for anybody that finds a basophil. All right?
Feels like a tampered bet.
Well, then that's $2. There you go. But you also got to remember that I'm the judge of whether it's a basophil or not. So, I'll be like checking my wall. I'll be like, yeah, there's not much of that. No, that's not one. All right. Platelets. When you look under the microscope, if you just see anything that's smaller than a red blood cell, that's kind of indistinct, that's going to be a platelet. Okay. Platelets are so small because they come from these really big cells called megakaryocytes that rupture into a gazillion pieces, and every one of those little pieces becomes a platelet. So they're very tiny. But that doesn't mean that they're not important. They are important, especially with blood clotting. They have little granules inside that release chemicals that help promote the blood clotting. Again, blood clotting, we'll discuss it next week, but it's a way of basically trying to fix your blood vessels when they're damaged as quickly as possible so that you don't lose a lot of blood through the hole that was there. Okay?
What was the name again for where they come from, the platelets?
Megakaryocytes. You'll see the name in a second. I'll show it to you. They have a lifespan of only about 5 to 9 days, so they don't live for very long. Here is a blood smear. You'll see something similar to this next week. You may not get this lucky on the first try. Like you may not see this many different white blood cells in one field. You're definitely going to have to use, that adjustment knob that's on the side that slides the slide around. You're going to have to scan around to try, especially if you want to win that $1. You're going to have to scan around to see if you can find the different types of white blood cells. I'll help you with that next week. I'll tell you what sets them apart, some things to look for, et cetera, et cetera. That was kind of the general overview. Any questions about blood in general yet? Isn't this better than cytotrophoblasts? And since I think it is, I don't know. Don't get me wrong, that stuff is interesting. Like if I could just sit down and know I wasn't going to be tested on it, I would love it. The fact that you have to answer questions about it's just a pain in the butt, It's like that embryology stuff, it's good to watch a video on. Find some narrator that you like Morgan Freeman or something, and then just watch a special about early embryos.
No, they made
Do they have do they have a good one or?
No, but they have Dr. Mike.
What's it called, amoeba?
You ever heard of the Amoeba Sisters? They did this in high school and bio.
No, so they
Yeah.
It's
That's
it's
shocking that
like-
you've never heard of that. That's a very popular thing.
I try to distance myself from popular things. What's that?
I said you're too good for that, high school.
Yeah, that's true, but exact what he said. That's what I meant. That's what I meant too. All right, so formation of blood cells. Formation of blood cells, surprisingly enough, if you're like me, it's not called hemogenesis or hematogenesis. I don't know why. I wasn't at the table when they decided on the name, but they call it hemopoiesis or hematopoiesis. And as you know, it all happens in the red bone marrow. And you kind of start off with these kind of great-great-grandmother blood cells called pluripotent stem cells. And I'll show you the family tree here in a moment. But from this one cell, you're going to be able to become all the different other blood cells as well as the platelets, okay? Now, most of your blood cells are born in the red bone marrow and they get their training while they're still in the red bone marrow, with the exception of what? Anyone know what cells have to leave the red bone marrow and get extra training? T cells, all right? T cells, again, they're also known as T lymphocytes. They are a type of white blood cell, and they're not quite done with their training when they leave the red bone marrow. And where do they have to go to get training? What's the name? Thymus, the thing that sits on top of the heart, right? They got it, and that's what the T stands for in T lymphocyte. It stands for thymus. So these guys have to go to the thymus to get training. We'll talk all about how that works when we do the lymphatic system chapter, but just as a memory trick, I told you I had a professor that called the thymus, maybe I didn't tell you this, I had a professor that called the thymus T-cell university, all right, because that's where they go to get training. It's brutal though. The graduation rate is 2%. It's awful. You guys have it lucky. You have it good in here. I wish we had a 2% graduation rate in here. Too easy on. Wow. I know. Wow.
That's literally why.
I still have some residual anger from before. I'm sorry. I'm still working. I didn't still get the coffee yet. Myeloid and stem cells. So I'm going to kind of skip this slide because this is basically explaining what's on the next slide. So let me just show you that picture. So up at the top is your great-great-grandmother blood cell. The pluripotent stem cell. By the way, what does the word pluripotent mean? It means it has, pluri means many, and then potent means sort of possibilities or potentials. So there's many potentials or many possibilities. It just means that it can become all these different cell types, okay? which is kind of redundant because that's what the word stem cell means, like kind of by definition, stem cells are cells that can go on to become other cells. By the way, what cell in your body, I asked this, let's see if you're better than the class this morning. All right, I'm crossing my fingers. They come through for me. What is the ultimate stem cell in the body? What cell is the ultimate stem cell?
I know.
There's one cell that's going to become all the other cells in the body. What is it? It's pretty obvious. What's the one cell that ultimately becomes all the other cells in the body? You have a name for it. It starts with the last letter of the alphabet. Zygote.
Yeah.
The zygote is the ultimate stem cell. Okay? From that one zygote, you're going to become all the other body cells. That is the ultimate stem cell. All right? I'm so let down. I thought, man, I was like, they're going to beat them. I know they're going to beat them. And they did. All right.
Question was that, man.
Oh, it wasn't a good question. Oh, God. All right. Here
I
we
just had
go.
100 of those.
All right. Anyway, this is a really busy slide. You don't get too worried about this slide. Let me just tell you the most important part. So you got this guy at the top. You should know that, the pluripotent stem cell. And then know that there's basically two kind of pathways it could follow. It could go down this side, the left side, and that's called the myeloid pathway or the myeloid stem cell line. And if it does that, it's pretty much going to it could become any of these guys down here. So it could become your red blood cells, could become your platelets, and then could become any of these white blood cells. And then it could even become two of your tissue cells that we'll talk more about later, mast cells and macrophages. You may remember those from AMP1. So just by following that myeloid line, you have all those possibilities. If you go to the right, you follow what's called the lymphoid line, and you can become any of those cells over there. So basically, if you're going to be a lymphocyte, you got to follow the lymphoid line. And I mentioned there's T lymphocytes, also known as T cells, B lymphocytes, also known as B cells, and then there's another type that the name doesn't really tell you it's a lymphocyte, you just have to remember that, something called natural killer cells. They're a special type of lymphocyte, okay? I know, it sounds really tough, right? B cells are the guys that make the antibodies. We'll discuss this a lot more in the lymphatic system chapter, but when they start producing antibodies, their name changes, and then they're referred to as a plasma cell. It's just more nonsense that you guys got to memorize, okay? Now, I mentioned erythropoietin before. Erythropoietin is what stimulates red blood cells to grow, okay? And specifically, the way that the erythropoietin is one of three different what are called hemopoietic growth factors. These are promoting the growth of your blood cells. So, you know, this guy promotes red blood cells. These guys promote white blood cells, and then this guy promotes platelet formation. What else are we going to say about this stuff? I'll come back. I'm going to talk about erythro one more time. I'll come back to that in a second. Specifically, I mentioned with the platelets before about the megakaryocytes. If you follow this diagram over here, notice this is that megakaryocyte that I was talking about, and that one huge cell is going to rupture into hundreds of pieces, and every one of those little pieces becomes a platelet. Okay? All right. So let's talk about the red blood cells in particular. And this is the last topic we're going to talk about today, and we'll save the white blood cells for next week. So red blood cells, the other name for red blood cells is erythrocytes. What does erythro mean?
Red.
It means red. What does cyte mean? Cell. So it literally means red cell. Remember this prefix, erythro. You will see it at other points probably in your career, especially if you go into like dermatology. Somebody that has a erythematous rash. What color is their rash? Red. They couldn't just say red rash. They had to say erythematous rash. But that you can charge for erythematous. That you earn money off erythematous. You can't earn any money off red, right? Mature red blood cells are special. They don't have a nucleus. They don't have any organelles, really. They're pretty much devoid of organelles. Instead, they are chock full of hemoglobin. Each red blood cell has about 280 million hemoglobin molecules inside of it. Okay? The other thing that's special about red blood cells is their shape. They, Melissa mentioned it before, they kind of look like a donut. If you look at them from the side, I put my, I got a situation, hold on a second.
Oh. Yeah, they call it
These markers work.
Mother Day.
Bummer.
Throw 'em out.
Throw them out. They're not really mine to throw out. Let me try one more in here before I give up completely.
Somebody's hoarding.
They look so good, like they're still in the package, like, oh, they're gonna work great, and then they don't.
Dollar store market. That's what happens.
It's gotta go into my private stash.
I was about to say.
What was I gonna say? What was I gonna say?
And then it turned into
Alright, so if you look at a red blood cell from the side, it sort of kind of looks like this. Okay? So this surface over here is concave, this surface over here is concave, and because there's two concave surfaces, that's why they call it the biconcave disc shape.
Bars.
This shape is really important because it increases the surface area, so it makes it easy for oxygen, more opportunities for oxygen to kind of cross the cell membrane and get inside the red blood cell. And it also creates a lot of flexibility for the red blood cell. When red blood cells come to your what's the name for your smallest blood vessels in the body? Capillaries. When red blood cells come to capillaries, the capillaries are so small that the red blood cells basically have to go through single file. And they need to have the red blood cells need to have some flexibility to be able to bend as they squeeze their way through these capillaries. And that biconcave disc shape creates some flexibility. Also, the fact that they don't have any organelles inside, that makes them flexible too. So no nucleus, no mitochondria, none of that other junk. They're pretty flexible. So that flexibility is super important. Now, when we were going over chapter 29 and we were talking about different inheritances, I did mention a disease where your blood cells can look kind of like this. What's that disease called?
Sickle cell.
Yeah, sickle cell disease. With sickle cell disease, you inherit a bad gene for the protein that makes up the hemoglobin protein, okay? So you're basically getting an abnormal form of hemoglobin, and that causes the entire red blood cell to straighten out like this. Now you might say, if you looked at this, you might be like, well, wait, isn't that awesome? That looks like it'd be super thin. Couldn't it just kind of sail its way through there because it's so thin? The problem is it becomes very rigid and stiff. It's not flexible, okay? And these guys can get trapped inside of these little capillaries, and then anything that's downstream is going to be deprived of oxygen and nutrients and all that stuff. So you're blocking off blood flow to different body areas. And when a person has sickle cell and they have an attack of sickle cell, depending on where the blood vessel is, they usually experience a lot of pain from a sickle cell attack, because when you deprive tissues of oxygen and blood flow, that's usually painful. It could be more severe though. I mean, if you are blocking off a blood vessel, say that's in your heart, then you can get a heart attack. If you're blocking off a blood vessel that's going up in your brain, then you could get a stroke. So, having that flexibility is super important just to get through the really small blood vessels. All right, hemoglobin, or HGB, another abbreviation. There was a lot of questions about abbreviations. I'm a little scared to go to the Scantron. I'm not gonna lie, but I'll do it. I'll go up there kind of like this, look at the Scantron, or whatever.
Oh, crap.
But we'll see. I got high hopes. We're gonna keep getting, Anyway, so hemoglobin, it's a protein. Inside one red blood cell are 280 million molecules of hemoglobin. Hemoglobin carries oxygen. That's what the purpose of hemoglobin is. The structure, it's made up of 4 polypeptide chains that they refer to as the globin chains. So it's a really big protein that's made up of 4 chains. And then in the middle of each of these chains is kind of where the action is. In the middle of each chain are what are called the heme groups. Okay? And in the middle of the heme groups, shown in red, are an iron atom. And the iron is where the oxygen actually attaches. Okay? Iron has the ability to hold on to oxygen in areas of the body where oxygen levels are high, like your lungs. But then iron will let go of the oxygen once the blood goes out to your tissues where there are low levels of oxygen. Okay? So that's what they mean by the word reversibly binds to oxygen. Iron holds on to oxygen in the lungs, and then when the blood gets pumped out to your tissues, the iron will let go of the oxygen. The oxygen has to then move through the cell membrane of the red blood cell, then the oxygen's in the plasma, and then it'll move through the wall of the blood vessel, and the oxygen will get out into the tissues where the cells are to keep the cells happy. Okay? So, how long do red blood cells live? 120 days. Not 119, not 121, 120. That's it. That's all they get. You are making red blood cells at a rate of 2 million per second, right? Boom, 2 million. Boom, 2 million. Boom, 2 million, right? And eventually, you would get too many red blood cells if it weren't for the fact that you're also destroying them that quickly, okay? So you're maintaining homeostasis because production and destruction are at the same rate, right? Now, this, the rest of this slide and the next slide has to deal with the death of the red blood cell. What happens when they reach that 120 days? And I'm just going to skip this and go to the picture because it's easier to explain. So let me walk you through the life of a red blood cell. So red blood cells are made in the red bone marrow. Great, you got your red blood cell. It's living its best life, but then it gets old and it reaches like 120 days old, okay? Living inside of mostly the spleen and the liver are these cells called macrophages. You have macrophages all over the body, but for red blood cells, the ones in the spleen and liver are especially important. These macrophages that are in the spleen and the liver, they're kind of like old age bouncers, okay? If you want to think of like the liver or the spleen as a really happening club, these macrophages are on the lookout for old people trying to get into the club, okay? And they look, they check their ID, they see if they're a member of AARP or whatever, you know, or if they know old TV references or whatever, and then they say, I'm sorry, but not only are you not going in the club, I'm going to kill you, okay? And the way that they kill them is the macrophages will basically phagocytize the red blood cells. They'll gobble them up, and then they'll destroy them. Now, I know I'm being kind of silly about it, but what you need to know from this, don't ask me why, but what you need to know from this is what happens to the hemoglobin that was inside of those red blood cells. The red blood cell is going to die, but what happens to the hemoglobin? And that's what this is showing you. So the first step in breaking down hemoglobin is to separate, just think of the word hemoglobin, is to separate the heme part from the globin part. In other words, back to this picture, you got to pull each of these little things off. Those are the heme groups. Pull those off, and then you're just left with the globin part. Now the globin part is just a protein, right? So the globin part, you can break that down, and you can get the individual amino acids, and you can recycle those amino acids and use them to make any protein that you want to, okay? So that's what happens to the globin part. What happens to the heme part is a little bit more complicated. So you've got the heme part. Remember, sitting in the middle of the heme is an iron molecule. The first step is to remove the iron from the rest of the heme. So notice the iron is coming off, and the iron can be transported through the blood by attaching it to a carrier protein called transferrin. And then the iron can actually be stored in your liver for long periods of time by attaching it to a protein there called ferritin. So your liver does many things, but one thing it does is it is a warehouse for extra iron. And when you want to make more red blood cells, you can take some of the iron out of the liver. Again, you have to attach it to transferrin, and then you can send it to the red bone marrow where it can be used to make some new red blood cells. Okay? So that's what happens to the iron. What happens to the heme part that no longer has the iron? Well, first it gets converted into a chemical called biliverdin, which you may not have heard of, but biliverdin, they colored it green up here because biliverdin has a greenish color to it, okay?
Oh, Billy Bird.
Biliverdin doesn't stick around long, though, before it gets converted into another substance that maybe you have heard of called bilirubin. All right, bilirubin I feel like I'm talking about a guy. Bilirubin is kind of yellowish, and that's why they changed the color there. And there's some fun facts to know about bilirubin. Not that fun, but like slightly fun. Fun within the context of the A&P world, put it that way. Bilirubin is going to be secreted by the liver. It goes through your bile ducts that we'll talk about in the digestive system chapter. And ultimately, you don't really need, I'm not so worried if you remember all these little steps that are shown here, but ultimately, bilirubin is responsible for the color of your urine by forming this chemical called urobilin, and it's also responsible for the color of your stool by forming this color called stercobilin. The other fun fact about bilirubin is, and I know you've heard of this condition before, what's the problem called where people's skin starts to turn kind of yellowish and the sclera of their eyes are yellow? Jaundice. Jaundice is when bilirubin levels are high in your blood, and then they can leak out of the blood and they can start staining your tissues, especially like the sclera of your eye, and give you kind of a yellowish discoloration. Now, there's lots of causes of jaundice, but again, they all involve somehow a buildup of bilirubin, okay? That's fun fact number one. The other fun fact about bilirubin that we've all probably experienced is when you get hit someplace in your body, you get a bruise, right? And when you first get hit, the bruise will look kind of reddish. That's because of red blood cells. That's because of damaged blood vessels in that area and red blood cells leaking out through the damaged blood vessels. That's going to make the whole area look kind of red at first. But as the red blood cells give up their oxygen, then the bruise turns and looks kind of purplish or bluish. And then when the macrophages show up, macrophages will be called to that area, wherever the bruise was, and they start to gobble up the red blood cells, and they start to process and destroy the hemoglobin, bilirubin will start to build up locally at that area. That's when your nasty bruise turns that yellowish color. Okay? So, fun fact. All right, now erythropoiesis, again, that's making red blood cells. What triggers it? Well, I mean, erythropoiesis, we're making red blood cells all the time, but your body will really kick it into gear if you expose your body to low oxygen levels in the environment. If you put yourself in a situation where oxygen levels are low in the environment, your body's response is, oh my God, there's not a lot of oxygen in the air. Let's make more red blood cells so we can grab as much oxygen from the air when the red blood cells, are pumped up to where the lungs are. Okay? That's your body's thinking. Let's get a lot of red blood cells to try to grab as much of that oxygen as possible. And that's all mediated through the release of erythropoietin. And erythropoietin, of all things, actually comes from the kidneys. So kidneys are kind of monitoring for low oxygen levels. If they detect it, they release erythropoietin, which goes to the red bone marrow. And specifically what erythropoietin does is it speeds up the step from a proerythroblast. This is, by the way, just a magnification of that other diagram. It speeds the development of the proerythroblast into the reticulocyte. Okay? Notice that a proerythroblasts, they're not showing you the picture, but you see down here it says nucleus ejected. Proerythroblasts are like regular body cells. They have a nucleus, okay? And they have organelles. They're like a regular body cell. But during this step, which again, this is the step that if you want to write erythropoietin over here, this is the step that erythropoietin speeds up. They will lose their nucleus during that step, and then they become known as a reticulocyte. Reticulocytes are basically like baby red blood cells. And we'll talk about reticulocytes on the next slide in a moment, but I just wanted to digress briefly to what I said before about erythropoietin. So erythropoietin is something that has been abused by performance athletes. It's a performance enhancing drug. They have synthetic forms of erythropoietin. I know a guy, no, I don't know a guy, but anyway, they have synthetic forms of erythropoietin that you can inject, and then that will stimulate your body to make more red blood cells. The more red blood cells you have, the more advantage you're going to have when you're running like a marathon, or if you're like, who's that famous cyclist
Lance?
What?
Lance Armstrong?
Yeah, Lance Armstrong. All right? You guys all know Lance Armstrong. That's like, well, I won't give you the whole history on Lance Armstrong. But anyway, he was the Tour de France winner. He was an incredible bicyclist. and then he just basically got busted for doing all this blood doping. Okay, the problem with giving yourself shots of erythropoietin is every time you do that, you're increasing your red blood cell count, and it's possible to have too many red blood cells, and that will make your blood thicker than it should be, and it has a hard time flowing through some of your little capillaries if it becomes too thick. So you're not allowed to do that if you're going to be a professional athlete. You're not allowed to give yourself injections of EPO. But what some athletes will do, which is allowed, is they will train at higher altitudes to naturally create a hypoxia situation, which will naturally stimulate their body to make more red blood cells. So, for example, if you were going to say, "Oh, I'm going to do the Boston Marathon," whatever the hell that is, before you go up and do the Boston Marathon, you could like fly out to Denver, right? Denver's in Colorado, it's up really high, right? Fly out there, and for a few months, practice out in Denver, and your body will make more and more red blood cells, so that then when you fly back to Boston for the marathon and you run, you're going to have a boatload of red blood cells that are going to be there to help you out when you run the race. And that, as far as I know, that's still legal. You can do that. You just can't give yourself shots of EPO. All right, reticulocytes, baby red blood cells. They are not quite mature yet in that they still have some organelles left in them. So they still have mitochondria, ribosomes, endoplasmic reticulum. But after being in the circulation for like 2 days, they will lose the rest of those organelles. Okay, so it just takes a few days. Once they lose those organelles, then they will be considered like true mature red blood cells. And you can, if you go and you get a blood test done, one of the things that they'll usually test is the reticulocyte count. And the reticulocyte count is the percentage of your red blood cells that are these reticulocytes, these baby red blood cells. In a normal person, around 1% of their red blood cells should be reticulocytes. You could see higher or lower numbers than this in people that have different problems. For example, if you had a person with some disease of their bone marrow, like a leukemia or something called aplastic anemia, some of those diseases, they can't make blood cells very effectively, so they might have a lower than normal reticulocyte count. You might see a higher than normal reticulocyte count in somebody that's had like a recent event where they've lost a lot of blood. If they've lost a lot of blood, their body's going to be trying to replenish and remake those red blood cells as fast as possible. So they'd probably be churning out a lot of reticulocytes in that situation, so they'd have a higher than normal count. Okay. All right, that's it. No more. Any questions about any of this stuff?
No more.
All right, so I will have those things graded pretty quickly, and I will shoot you